Welcome back to the Fantasy Labs podcast. This is Bryan. We are here Wednesday night. We're going over the NFL slate. Busy slate. We got 16 games. Obviously, everyone these later slates in the year are pretty full because there's no bye. So we got all the teams played. Definitely really busy, and we got a full guys here. We got me and Peter Jennings, aka CSU Ram 88. We got Jonathan Bales, and then special guests. We have Chris Raybon, a great NFL writer, really just great DFS writer in general, and he has graciously agreed to come onto the podcast on this Christmas week and spend his time hanging out with us and talking NFL. So Chris, how you doing?
I'm good, Bryan. Thanks for having me on. Big fan of the pod.
Cool. Yeah, appreciate you coming on. I know it's a busy week, but glad to have you on, and I think we got a good foursome here to run through the slate. So we're gonna jump in, and we're gonna break it down by position here, just because I think it's a little bit quicker with four guys. So we'll start with the quarterback position, and I'll kind of pitch it to you guys, just so you guys can get as much time in as you can. And Pete, I'll start with you. So. What are your approaches to the quarterback position? I know you're a big cash player, obviously, and I know Bales is a big tournament player. So maybe start with your cash game plays, and we can move on to Chris and Bales and get their thoughts on the tournament guys.
I think the number one quarterback play this week for sure on DraftKings is Blake Bortles, only 6,500, going against the Saints, who have just been absolutely atrocious against the quarterback. Still way too cheap. He's thrown a bunch of balls down the field. He's been an elite fantasy quarterback. Without having the matchup against the Saints. So I think he's hands down the number one quarterback. I also think Ben Roethlisberger is a really good play against Baltimore. So there's a variety of guys I'm pretty bullish on overall this week, but I think those are the two cash game guys.
Yeah. So Chris, what are your thoughts on cash? Are there obviously those guys seem to be kind of the obvious plays. Are you kind of in agreement there?
Yeah, I'm in agreement. Blake Bortles has to be the number one guy. Roethlisberger, of course. I think, if on FanDuel, as opposed to DraftKings, I think you could go with Matthew Stafford if you really wanted to save some money. He's been performing well lately. He has a matchup against the Niners at home, and they have a pretty strong team total as well. But those are the three guys I'm looking for. I guess we could kick it over to Bales. I wanted to hear, thoughts on Russell Wilson this week, because I feel like he's going to be highly owned in cash games just because of his recent play. And I wonder, how you guys feel about that.
Yeah, Bales, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I think most people are going to be maybe smarter. I guess I would say he's going to be higher owned at lower stakes because of the recent performance, and much lower owned at higher stakes because of the matchup, and still the pretty high price, $300 from being top price. So yeah. I would say it depends on the stakes. So $3, $9, things like that. I think that Wilson will be probably over-owned and maybe potentially under-owned because of the matchup and like a 300 or a 1K or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely fair. Yeah, but I think you're right. Blake Bortles is definitely going to be kind of the chalkiest guy. I mean, the Saints are just awful against quarterbacks. I mean, they're allowing, over 10 points over expectation, when we factor in salary to quarterbacks. So just really awful. And it's kind of hard to get off them or get off him, particularly in cash games. And then Ben, you're right, just kind of had a really good game last week, and then kind of gets other than the Saints, the best matchup on the board in the Ravens. So I guess kind of moving to tournaments, Pete, what are your thoughts on maybe some favorite tournament guys at the quarterback spot?
I think Derek Carr is a really interesting tournament play this week at only $5,600 against San Diego. I know they've been worse against the run than they have the past, but Oakland seems like a team that's going to throw kind of no matter what the matchup is. So I like Derek Carr to Amari Cooper or to Crabtree. Obviously, Cooper had that really nice game last week. I think that's a pretty attractive play. In addition to that, there's some other guys who I don't love, but I mean they certainly are good tournament plays. Cam Newton will probably be heavily owned, which is why I don't love him, but he's in play every single week. Other guys, like Phillip Rivers in that same Oakland matchup isn't terrible. Alex Smith I could see for really dirt cheap, even though I never play him, but he's certainly an option that's going to go low owned if you wanted to pair him with like a Macklin or something like that.
Yeah, Cam is definitely interesting. I was a little bit surprised. Pete and Jonathan were at the FFWC this past weekend, and I was pretty surprised at Cam's ownership in that tournament. Jonathan, was that a little bit surprising to you to see him as low owned as he was?
Yeah, for sure. So if I had known that, then I would have rostered Cam.
Sure,
100%. I thought he was going to be maybe 15% owned or something like that. He was one of 3 quarterbacks I was looking at. It was, I believe, Rivers, Newton, and Tyrod, who I played. But yeah, that was super surprising to me. This week, I think that Newton is in play in actually every format. I would be fine with if someone played him in cash, just because he accounts for such a high percentage of their of the team's fantasy scoring. So even at 7,500 in a matchup that might not look that great, team projected at 27 implied points. He's just such a safe option right now, even with the lack of weapons.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And another guy I think is fairly interesting. Chris, you were talking just kind of recency bias, especially with Russell. I think a guy who's really going to be affected by recency bias and potentially in this matchup where he could exploit it, especially these cornerbacks on the outside for Philly are just really awful. We've talked about this a lot in the pod. A situation where quarterbacks can exploit, especially with their receivers, is Washington and Kirk Cousins going against Philly. Is that a guy that potentially you're interested in, or are you worried about ownership in GPPs?
No, I'm not. I don't think I'm too worried about Cousins' ownership in GPPs because I still don't think he'll be the super high owned just because Bortles on the Saints and Cam Newton coming off another huge game. I love Cousins. I think he's really started to emerge this year, and he's kind of going under the radar, but he's really improved his play. He's not a turnover machine like he once was. He's adding some rushing touchdowns in. So I like Cousins. And another guy, speaking of recency bias in the opposite direction, that I think will go way low owned, that always has huge upside, is Carson Palmer. And he's in a matchup with the Green Bay Packers. Now he's 7K, so he's right between Roethlisberger and Russell Wilson and Cam Newton and all those guys. And a lot of people will roster David Johnson. So we know how volatile touchdowns can be. Last week, Johnson got 3 rushing touchdowns, so Carson Palmer, didn't really get to throw his usual multiple touchdowns, but that could easily swing the other way. This weekend, the Cardinals have a pretty strong team total, and they're at home. And Aaron Rodgers is always liable to force the opposing offense to keep on playing, even though Green Bay is having some trouble this year. So that's a guy I think will be low owned that I would be looking at as well.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, and that total is the highest on the slate. As some of these games don't have a total announced, kind of waiting on some injuries and stuff. But as of the lines that we have today, the highest one on the slate is 49.5 for the Packers Cardinals. So obviously a lot of points there, and the Cardinals are pretty solid favorites. I mean, they're 4.5 point favorites. I guess it's not crazy high, but against the Packers, that's not bad. So implied points puts them at 27, which is tied for the highest on the slate. So we're expecting some points out of the Cardinals. The question is whether it's coming out of the running game or passing game. So Bales, I'll ask you. So I think something really interesting about Palmer is that he's exactly the same price on DraftKings as Aaron Rodgers. And so do you think that affects ownership because people just are like, if I'm going to pay $7,000, I'm going to pay for Aaron Rodgers, who's the best quarterback in football, right?
Yeah, I think that phenomenon affects ownership for sure. I think most people will be on Palmer though. I don't know that they'd be on Rodgers now, playing poorly and probably in a worse matchup. So I like both of the guys that Chris mentioned, Palmer and Kirk Cousins. I think Kirk Cousins is it's really easy to stack him, and you could potentially double stack in that game with Deshaun and Jordan Reed. And I like the fact that he's going to run any team against the Eagles runs whatever is 10, 15% more plays than they normally would because the Eagles offense runs so fast. So Eagles also 3-point favorites. So I like the Cousins play there, and maybe the Cousins double stack with a lot of upside throwing a bunch. But yeah, I think Palmer's a good point. I think this past week was the first week that he didn't exceed his salary-based expectation on the year.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I love Palmer. That's a great leverage play. I think Chris makes a great point that recency bias is going to lead people to David Johnson, who is still a good play, but in tournaments you can gain a lot of you can gain a lot of ground. You have a lot of leverage going with Palmer. Who would you guys stack him with if you had to choose one guy to stack him with this week?
I personally would still be playing Floyd. I think Floyd is still very under. I thought Floyd was the most obvious wide receiver play last week. When you're getting a guy he's like maybe an elite talent in the league, dropping to, I think he's like 3,800, right? So I still like Michael Floyd, who I think is just an amazing player. Larry Fitzgerald, I think we're now seeing his age, and we see this so often. It's just like very predictable. The older guys start to decline in the second half and really the last quarter of the season. So Floyd would be my guy.
Yeah, same here. I'm going Floyd. I don't have a problem with John Brown because John Brown actually does get a lot of red zone targets. I believe he's leading the team in red zone targets over the past 6 weeks. I think the only guy I really didn't want, like Bales said, is Fitzgerald, because he's still getting a lot of targets, but they're misleading because he's really settled into that role as slot receiver, and he's not really getting as many of the vertical throws anymore. His average depth of target is down. He's averaging under 10 yards a catch over the last 6 weeks. So,
good stuff.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Cool. Pete, I can't move on to running back before asking you about your boy Brock. I mean, he dominated the first half and then couldn't do anything in the second half. What are your thoughts on him? And that Denver is that Monday night game, so obviously some tournaments could come down to that Denver-Cincy matchup. What are your thoughts on Denver and kind of their offense right now?
Well, he's clearly going to be under-owned, and I like him again with Demaryius Thomas. I played Demaryius Thomas in the DraftKings Championship. I think Demaryius is an elite play pretty much every single week with his targets. Hopefully he can just stop dropping the ball. And when that happens, he'll have a really, really big game. But Brock, the matchup's not the best, but the benefit there is just the low ownership. I think only one person, Beat by Majid, rostered him in the DraftKings final. Yeah,
it was 0.5. But it was only Beep. Yep. Cool. All right, let's keep on moving. Let's move to running backs. And Pete, I'll bounce to you. Just kind of get your main cash game plays before we move on to Chris and Bales and get theirs.
Right. So David Johnson's definitely a viable option in cash. I think he's going to be heavily owned again, especially after last week. So definitely we'll have some exposure to him. From the Buffalo situation, I think Carlos Williams, from everything I'm reading, is going to be the guy. Obviously, with McCoy out, it could be a split situation there, but I still prefer Carlos Williams' talent. So I think he's a really nice play this week. I'll have a good amount of him in my cash games. Then after that, it gets kind of tricky trying to differentiate some of these guys in certain spots. Latavius Murray is someone I like a ton for tournaments. I could be convinced to really get on him in cash games at only 5,000. And after that, it's tough. I think a lot of these guys are more fringe tournament plays than they are cash. Frank Gore always ranks high in our stuff. I'm just not a fan of playing older guys at the end of the year. So it's kind of a weird spot for me at running back this week. I'm not really in love with too many guys.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Chris, you got any cash game plays for sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty much locked in on David Johnson and then D'Angelo Williams, just because I don't really like the rest of the running back field this week. I think it's really weak, and a lot of the guys are just pure tournament plays, to the point where I was actually experimenting before we came on air with some DraftKings lineups, cash game lineups, and a lot of times I ended up playing a wide receiver in the flex, which I really do not like to do on DraftKings in cash games, but I really do not like the running backs. I think one thing I think that's interesting is Adrian Peterson, coming off the ankle injury for tournaments. He looks like he's going to go, and the Giants, especially if they're without Beckham, probably will struggle to move the ball. That could be a lot of time of possession for the Vikings, and the Giants have not stopped the run very well. So I think he's an interesting tournament play. But in cash games, I'm pretty much on Johnson and D'Angelo Williams.
So are you worried, Chris, about the game flow that potentially that Pitt-Baltimore game could be heavy pass for the Steelers, and then D'Angelo doesn't get as much?
I'm not really, because if you look back at D'Angelo's last 6 games, since he took over for Le'Veon Bell. He's averaging over 20 touches. He's averaging 120 yards per game and 1 touchdown per game. And in games where he doesn't carry the ball a lot, he's getting 5 or more receptions. I think he's just a major part of their offense. And because of the large spread, that's just another running back friendly situation. Even if they heavily pass, that doesn't mean that D'Angelo won't get goal line opportunities. Even Antonio Brown scores a lot more touchdowns at home than he does on the road, and they're on the road. So that if Antonio Brown's touchdown potential goes down, that naturally would benefit D'Angelo. And just because of the volume and the offense that he's in, I think he's still pretty much the second safest cash game play besides David Johnson.
Yeah, Bales, do you have any main cash game guys?
No. So I like Chris's idea of, and I also never really do this, but I think that you can play a receiver in the flex in your cash games this week. I think that makes some sense. I don't think that there's anyone really obvious. I'll probably play David Johnson, and I also do like D'Angelo. I want to talk more about D'Angelo for tournaments because I think I'm having a difficult time predicting his ownership because there's not very many running back options. I think he is one of the better plays, but a lot of people are going to be on Roethlisberger to Brown, and Martavis is underpriced, which we'll talk about. So it's difficult. I'm having a very difficult time determining how popular D'Angelo will be in tournaments, but I'm okay with him in cash games as well. And same thing with AP. So I would say those 3 guys, but I probably will play only 2 running backs and a wide receiver in the flex and cash in all likelihood.
Interesting. So one guy that none of you guys mentioned, but I'm actually looking in cash is Denard Robinson, assuming that TJ Yeldon is out. New Orleans, obviously, like we know that they're awful in the pass game, but it's not like they're great in the run game either. And so that potentially would worry me that it could get into a shootout between Bortles and Breeze, especially Breeze being at home. But, Denard Robinson got a lot of targets. What he get 10 targets last week? Yeah. So it's not like a guy that I'm really worried about game script. I think that even if they got into a shootout, he would be really involved. So I think he's pretty safe for me, especially if Yeldon's out and he's getting all of that volume. But maybe he's more tournament. I don't know. I'll go back to Pete. Your thoughts on Robinson, and then maybe your favorite tournament plays.
I think Robinson's a great play. I should have mentioned him. He's not showing up high on my stuff right now because I have Yeldon as questionable to doubtful, and I just looked it up. It sounds like the brace was still in practice today, and he's kind of more on the side of doubtful. So he'll immediately vault into an elite play, and I think my combo would probably be David Johnson and Robinson. Definitely like D'Angelo for tournaments, kind of for the same reason Bales said. I think he's a nice leverage play. So I'll be using him a lot. Someone in San Diego is going to do well too, probably. Could easily be David Whitehead again. There's a variety of guys I think are decent tournament plays just because running back is such a mess this week. In the Kansas City situation, if Ware misses again, which I'd be surprised, I guess, if he does, but if he did, I'd be all over Charkandrick West. That's a situation to monitor. And then potentially might be on one of these one of the Philadelphia running backs. If we can get some clarification there. Sproles with the Eagles D could be a great combination as a double dip. So that's kind of how I'm looking. I really hate the running back position relative to other positions this week.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. So Chris, we'll move to you. And, you talked about D'Angelo's maybe potentially cash or tournament, but do you have guys that are maybe tournament only that you really like at the running back spot?
Yeah, there's a couple of guys, and the reason I actually like them is because I think they're in questionable situations where people will shy away because they might be in a committee. And one of those guys is Charkandrick West. I think he's shown that he can produce even in really tough matchups this year when he gets volume. Now, Spencer Ware was active last week, didn't play. He's supposedly dealing with a really painful rib injury. And this is a game where Kansas City is favored by a lot. So I would think that if they get up, even though you think of West more as Ware, more as the hammer back to kind of close out games, I think if they get up big, I think they would actually preserve Ware kind of like they did last week and use West, and I think he has major upside. And then another guy, I think you guys mentioned him already, but Carlos Williams, we saw Mike Gillislee actually break a couple long runs in these last few weeks. But I think Carlos Williams, if he's healthy, he has major upside. He was a touchdown machine before he got hurt as well. So he's in a situation where he's technically should be ahead of Gillislee, and there's always a chance that he can get 15 to 20 touches. I really like him. So those are the guys I'm looking at. And then besides that, it really is ugly. I would say, I think Tim Hightower is a guy I would look at, but I'm a little worried because his snap percentage went down from 71% in week 14 to 43% in week 15. But Jacksonville is a team that can be scored on, and we don't know what's going on with Breeze. So, I think they would lean heavily on Hightower, maybe either way. And this is the over-under on this game was over 50 before the Breeze news came out. So we'll see what happens there. But there's potentially a game where Hightower could get a couple of layups at the goal line, and he's still pretty cheap. So I think he's a guy, recency bias will probably have him a little under-owned because he didn't really do well against the Lions. But I'd look at him in the tournament as well.
Yeah, I like the Hightower call for sure, and especially in tournaments. So, Bales, one thing that I noticed in your choice of running backs in the final this past weekend was sometimes we hear, like, I guess the thing to do, like when you read articles that are like how to construct a tournament lineup, is you want to pay up for wide receivers who have volatility, and you want to find bargain at running backs. But it almost seemed like you kind of identified that like everyone knows that now. So really the value is to maybe potentially pay up for running backs because you could get them at a lower ownership discount. Because you went Devontae and AP. I know AP got injured, but it seems like that was your strategy. Is that something you're looking at again?
Yeah, so in that particular situation, and I talked to Peter about this, I think on Saturday, my initial lineup actually was Devontae, AP, and McCoy. So I was really paying up. And then I switched it, and I went with I think I had Bolden in there at one point. And then when the Spencer Ware news came out, I thought that we need to go Shark-Kendrick. But yeah, so in that particular situation, I know people that do want to definitely use that strategy in general. And then last week, there were so many cheap options. You had Bolden, you had Denard, you had West, that I knew that the most contrarian thing to do was going to be to pay up, I thought. So that's what I tried to do, other than West, who I thought was too good of a value to not play. And in general, yes, I do like that. And so my top tournament play this week is also one guy that I used last week, and that's Devontae Freeman, who I think is a really interesting tournament play. He's the most expensive again. He's $100 more than AP, who's probably maybe a comparable value, maybe a little bit better value. The Panthers are favored by 7 points, but Devontae keeps getting all these targets, right? So like he adds so much value as a receiver out of the backfield. So I think he has a ton of upside. So it's just a matter of like flipping a coin on when they get in the red zone. Is he going to steal those touchdowns from Julio more or less? And he has a lot this year. They've I think at one point he was running the ball inside the 5 or inside the 10, like way more than any running back in the league. So they definitely feed him when they're in there. So Devontae would be my contrarian tournament play. Definitely not worth it in cash for sure, but tournament, I like that idea of paying up for a running back.
Yeah, it's always good to zig, when other people are zagging. Chris, back to you. Another guy that I'm interested in this week is the guy on the other side of Devontae Freeman. It's Artis Payne, who got the start for Carolina. And, we thought that we weren't sure who it was going to be. We thought maybe Fozzie Whitaker would get some touches, and that would be maybe a running back by committee. But, they went pretty heavy Cameron Artis-Payne. It's not like he got like above 20 carries, but he got 14. He was involved in the pass game as well. Gets a really good matchup here in Atlanta. They're favorites. Atlanta's not great against the run, and he's really cheap at 4,300. So, he's a rookie. Rookies kind of come on a little bit in the end of the year, but it's not like he's been playing that much. Is he interesting to you at all?
He's not super interesting to me. Like, I think he's a viable tournament play just because Carolina has such a high team total and he did lead them in touches. I would like to he played 40% of the snaps last week. I would like to have a guy that I'm paying for at running back get a little more than that. And then there's always, the thing, it really comes down to, we always worried about Jonathan Stewart with the red zone looks and stuff. Yeah. So now it's like, well, do they trust? Are they going to feed Artis Payne in close, or is it just going to be the Cam Newton show? Is he going to throw for another 5 touchdowns? So that, with Carolina, it always kind of turns me off to running backs. Jonathan Stewart, I started to play him in tournaments near the end of the season before he got hurt a little bit more because he started getting a lot of those red zone looks. But I'm probably not as confident that Artis Payne might get those looks, and then he might just have another week like last week where he put up, good yardage. He put about 90 yards total, 93 yards total.
Yeah.
But I'm a little worried about his touchdown potential.
Yeah, that's definitely fair for sure. But definitely, if you take a chance in a big tournament, a guy to potentially look at. Cool. Any last words for running backs before we move on to wide receivers?
I'll throw one guy who you guys will probably think I'm absolutely insane, but it's the ultimate recency bias play where everyone's going to be, fearful of playing Buck Allen after the benching and the one fumble. But this game flow could set up extremely well for him, given that they're probably going to, be down in this game, and they'll probably have to abandon the run, which I actually think is pretty good for Buck Allen because he gets a ton of catches if he's in the game. So assuming he has the confidence of the coaches, he could be the ultimate kind of bounce back after getting benched after the fumble last week.
I like that.
Cool. All right. Well, let's keep on moving over to wide receivers. And Pete, I'll bounce it right back to you, and we'll start with you since you're the big cash game player. What are your favorite cash game wide receivers?
Number one receiver is Allen Robinson. I'm going to be all in on him. I know Delvin Breaux is, not the worst corner and actually was playing pretty well to start the season, but the Saints have just been so bad recently. I think, he's clearly the number one option there. And I'm just a really big believer in his talent. So I like him quite a bit, like Allen Hurns too. Basically bullish on that entire passing situation. So I think that's a really good area to attack. I also like the Pittsburgh receivers. I think we'll see a lot of people on Antonio Brown, and rightfully so. Martavis Bryant is a really good play, I think, this week at only 5,600. Obviously, Brown went off last week, and he didn't have a great game, but that could really pay dividends, switching from Brown to Bryant. Deshaun Jackson, we have the narrative street right here going back to Philly. I could buy it, especially in this matchup. Not really my favorite type of player to play in cash games, but I could easily see a really nice game from him. And then I'm still kind of attacking Golden Tate as a cash game guy. 5,800 on DraftKings, not the best price, but I like the way he's getting peppered with targets. And they've been using him a lot when they get down in the red zone as well. So I think he's a nice play there.
Cool. Chris, favorite cash game plays?
I like Golden Tate a lot. He has been catching 6, 7 or more balls in over the last 5-6 weeks. So I think he's in a really good spot. I love Martavis in cash game. Everyone, kind of saw Antonio Bryan go nuts last week, but Martavis actually had 10 catches last week. Martavis hasn't been, he hasn't been under 8 targets since week 9. And I'm still going to ride the Doug Baldwin train. I think the Rams, another team that looks like they're a tough matchup, but they've over the last 4 games, they've actually given up 301 yards per game passing. So Doug Baldwin's really locked in right now. He's got a chance to make history, and I think Russell Wilson knows that. I think Doug Baldwin has a chip on his shoulder since that whole mediocre thing, and I'm rolling with him until he the wheels come off basically at this point. I do like Robinson. A little worried about Robinson only because of how Delvin Breaux's been playing and how Robinson's game against Vontae Davis went, where he caught the touchdown, but he didn't get a ton of volume. He's actually gotten 5 and 4 targets over his past 2 games. So a little concerned there, but I would still be okay with playing him. And then another guy that people aren't really talking about, but I think he's a solid cash play at this point is Kamar Aiken. He 7 straight weeks, he's caught at least 5 passes. He's averaged 6 catches for 76 yards over a 7-week period, which is a pretty strong sample size. and he's got double-digit targets in 3 of his last 4 games, 4 of his last 6 games, and the Steelers are ranked dead last in the NFL in strength of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I'm okay with Kamara. I think that's a play I really like, and he doesn't really get a lot of attention.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff because he wasn't even on my radar. But yeah, you're right. I think I was just overlooking him for probably dumb reasons. I just kind of wrote off the Baltimore offense. But yeah, I really like that call. Bales, do you have any favorite cash game plays?
Yeah, I had Aiken in my championship lineup last week, and I took him out, and he got lucky. He got lucky with the Hail Mary, so I don't know if that was a bad call, but he has been. And one of the reasons that I took him out is also I think he was just a low ceiling player in general. But yeah, I think that play is decent. I think the best cash game play this week is probably Allen Robinson, and then there's a number 1 receiver on an offense projected at 27 points, and he costs $6K, and he's averaging 10 targets per game over the past month. Who is that?
J Mac.
Yeah, Jeremy Maclin. I think even with the line and being a big favorite, I think he's way too underpriced, given just how they're using him. More or less since not since Charles went out, but recently. If you're getting 10 targets a game and you cost $6K and your team's projected at 27 points, then you should probably be in the conversation.
So you're fine with him in cash?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I respect that. So we'll kind of make the tournament rounds now, and I'll go back to you, Peter. Do you have any favorite tournament plays? I know probably Allen Robinson. Some of these guys that are cash plays obviously have really high ceilings as well, so I don't think you should go off of them in tournaments, but maybe some guys that we haven't touched on that you think aren't cash viable but really good tournament plays here.
All right, so this is the guy that I used all year in the beginning of the year, let me down consistently, but I'm back on the bandwagon of Jordan Matthews at 4,400 here against Washington. I think he's a really nice play for tournaments. 11 targets last week. He did go off, so that might he might have a little bit higher ownership than he normally would, but that price is still dirt cheap. I think he could have a really, really nice game, especially, this game turns into any type of shootout where it's back and forth. I expect him to be a nice benefit in that situation. I was going to mention Maclin, but, of course, Bales took that. I think he's an elite play in tournaments. I like him for cash games as well. And if you're going to go with Bortles now and Robinson, I think Brandon Cooks is another really good option. Obviously, you want to watch the Breeze news, but we'll see what happens there. I like Brandon Cooks a lot in tournaments if he has a decent quarterback throwing it to him. Yeah,
I like the Brandon Cooks call a lot. Yeah, obviously Breeze is important for this slate, but Cooks has been really good lately, and I think this is a good call in tournament, especially in that matchup. Chris, I'll bounce it to you for your tournament plays.
I like Mike Evans in tournaments. I think he fits that mold of a really talented, volatile receiver. He's in a game where Vincent Jackson doesn't look like he's healthy, and Mike Evans' targets have really spiked when Jackson is not in the lineup. So I really like him. I think New England will do whatever they can to stop Brandon Marshall. I think that's good news for Eric Decker. We kind of, I think some people think of him as kind of a low ceiling guy. He does come out of the slot, so that caps his ceiling a little bit, but especially with New England paying what I think they're going to do is pay extra attention to Brandon Marshall. I think Eric Decker is a great tournament play. I think he always goes overlooked, and I think he has that multi-touchdown upside, even though he's pretty much had 1 touchdown in every game this year, but never 2. I think that upside is still there. And I think if Breeze is healthy, Willie Snead, 4,500. The Jaguars are ranked 25th in schedule-adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers. Snead caught 10 balls last week as well. And I think a lot of people, more people will be on Cooks and possibly even Watson. So I think I really like Snead. And then I'm kind of upset that Stephon Diggs went off last week because I think that will raise his ownership. I'm not sure by how much because I'm not sure how many people really know about him yet. But I'm of the opinion that he's a really good receiver. He doesn't fit the typical mold of like a big big guy, but I think he's a really talented receiver, can do a lot. And the Giants have been really bad against the pass all season. So this is one of those matchups where, the Giants miss tackles, they blow assignments and things like that. And this is just the kind of matchup where I think a guy like Stephon Diggs could take advantage. He might not be ready for prime time yet, but against the Giants, I think he's definitely could pay off.
I like that call quite a bit. I'm a huge Diggs fan. A 5-star recruit in high school. Loved him in Maryland where he could stay healthy. Health has always been the big concern, but he is explosive and has great lateral quickness, and he's an elusive receiver as well, which could play really well against the Giants, like you said, who are terrible at tackling. So I like that call quite a bit.
Diggs, Peter's been scouting Diggs since he was 8 years old on YouTube.
I remember watching some YouTube highlights of him. Just nasty.
Yeah.
He is, man. He's impressive, man. Like I remember seeing him. His first game, I believe, was against the Broncos, and we know how good their defense is. And I believe he caught like 6 passes for 87. And I was like, who is this guy actually getting fantasy points with Teddy Bridgewater? Like, who is this guy? And he's good. He's good.
Love that call.
Yeah. Bales, go ahead.
I also love Jordan Matthews this week. Way too cheap, and I don't even think he's going to have that high of ownership because so many people were burned by him this year. So even at 44, I mean, we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's just way too cheap. So Matthews against the Redskins, I think, is a really great tournament play. I'm going to have a lot of them. And then the guy who a lot of people are scared of, I think, now after the past 2 games, but probably, if you can deal with that risk, and now is the time to get on him, is Calvin at 7,400 against the Niners. Really high team total. We know he's an elite receiver. I'm not really too concerned about the age or him wearing down as much just because he's a freak. He's like an Adrian Peterson where you're just we know he's going to play longer than some other guys. So Calvin I like a lot. Michael Floyd, who we had talked about. And then Decker's really interesting to me. I think we need to – it's just tough. Are the Patriots going to take out Brandon Marshall? If they are, then Decker, I love him in tournaments. But I think Decker is not an elite receiver, but he's really, really good. And I think maybe the Patriots are smart enough to know he's really, really good, where maybe they just play like cover 2 or something and try to take both of them out. So I'm not convinced that they're going to 100% try to take out Marshall. So that would be my concern there.
If they play cover 2, though, I mean, wouldn't that – if they play straight up, I would think that would just benefit both of them. Like, do you really think if they play – because Logan Ryan and Butler, aren't they kind of better man corners? Like, if they played cover 2, I would think the Jets' offense is good enough to move the ball.
Decker's an elite red zone target. That's the thing. Yeah. That's where he has the values. He's an elite red zone player. So
he's one of the best red. Yeah, he scored in Denver with Tebow in the red zone.
Right.
Right.
No.
I love Decker. I'm going to play him every chance that I get. But
yeah, you do love Decker.
I'm not convinced that even if it's not cover 2, I'm not convinced that they're automatically going to go after Marshall as opposed to Decker.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So a couple guys I do want to hit on real quick, just because I think they're in interesting spots. Like if you just kind of look, when I first open up the slate, I just kind of look through prices before I get biased on matchups, just because I want to see where guys are. And I think that, there's 2 guys that are just kind of interesting pricing spots, because you have Antonio, who's obviously in an amazing matchup, and I think that a lot of people are going to look at him. He's at 93. And then we've talked about how great of a spot Allen Robinson is, obviously going against the Saints secondary, who are awful, at 75. And then so it's kind of like, I feel like a lot of people are either going to like justify paying up for Antonio or just elect to pay down for Allen Robinson, which leaves like 2 elite receivers right in the middle, which is DeAndre Hopkins and Julio. So I guess I'll kick it to one of you guys. Chris, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on those guys? Obviously, they have as much upside as anyone. It seems like they could be a little overlooked this week.
Yeah, I was just thinking that Julio's price, I believe, is at a season low, or at least as low as it's been since the early part of the season. And we saw Josh Norman get beat last week by Beckham. Now, Beckham's a different kind of receiver than Julio, but I would think at some point Atlanta would smarten up and say, okay, we're not getting the production we want out of Julio when they're facing Carolina. It's been 3 straight games where he's been kind of held in check. So I would expect them to do some different things, move him to the slot, take some more shots deep, do something. So I think that's a really good spot. And then, DeAndre Hopkins, I like him too. The real thing with DeAndre is it seems like since Hoyer's been out, his production has kind of dipped a little. I know it was dipping a little bit before too, but I like DeAndre as well. I think Tennessee is not an imposing matchup at all. Their cornerbacks are not very good. And DeAndre is a guy that he can just get open. So if there's just competent quarterback play and it gets into one of those type of games, there's going to be 2 backup quarterbacks facing off. It could turn into one of those sloppy games.
Mm-hmm.
I really like DeAndre. I think his ownership is going to be super low, like potentially under 5%, and Julio's as well. So, I love those calls on both of those guys.
Cool. And just before we move on to tight end, we've talked about a lot of the elite receivers, but sometimes it's always good to throw out some bargain receivers that you could potentially get some salary relief. That's a pretty easy way to get a good tournament team is to get a guy who can go off for pretty cheap. So I'll kick it to Bales or Peter. If you guys have a guy potentially, I guess I'll start. But I think that if Beckham is going to be out, maybe you could look at like a Ruben Randall or some guy for the Giants who we think would step up with targets. But is there a guy maybe in like the 4 or 5 range and under that's interesting you? I guess I'll start with Bales and then go to Peter.
Go to your boy, Bales.
We had talked about Matt. Oh, yeah.
Oh, DGB?
DGB.
Yeah.
I'm on him every week now, so. I thought that was just a super sharp call. No. No, that was my favorite play last week. So, yeah, I'm fine with him. He's just an elite receiver. He's going to develop, and he's starting to get on the field. They're throwing him the ball. So, yeah, I'm fine with that. We talked about Jordan Matthews. Yeah, so here's an interesting guy, a little above that range. I'm probably not going to be on him, but what do you think about Dez at 55 now?
Wow. Yeah, Pete, what are your thoughts?
He's not on my radar, but maybe he should be. I don't know.
At 55, he's just he's probably a top 5 player. What do we do with him?
Is he a top 5 player though? Like that's
at receiver, I think he is. I think he's top 5. He's definitely top 7, right?
If he's 100% healthy, he definitely is. I don't know. I just watched him, and even with the bad quarterback play, I've watched a little bit of film on it. He's just not getting open. Like in the past, he'd get really open, and he could use his size, but he just doesn't look as explosive. And I kind of have the same thing with Calvin, and maybe by the end of maybe by next year he'll be totally right. In which case, obviously, with Romo back, I'll be heavy on playing Dez, especially at the beginning of the year when he's way too cheap. But I just don't like that situation. I don't like that offense. I mean, against in Buffalo, I haven't checked the weather yet, but I mean, I don't know. I just
No. I highly doubt that I'm gonna be on it, but it is. We don't really ever see truly elite guys. Like, look who's in his range. We don't see those guys go to 5,500.
Never. Yeah, you're right.
T.Y. Hilton is calling for some more long balls, but he has severe home road splits, so I won't love him. He's more expensive.
You could look at Moncrief as well at 4,300 is another guy in that range, although I think he's going to be popular after last week, and we'll see. But he has a really good matchup, and he's 43.
The Giants receivers are all in play. Odell Beckham's suspension was upheld, so he's out. So I think those are the guys that we want to pay attention to.
Yeah, so who's your favorite of those, Pete?
Probably Randall. I just think he's a better touchdown maker, but we'll see. I need to research that situation a little bit more. I mean, I like the Dwayne Harris Giants defense if you want to go that way. Try to get a double dip, but in Minnesota, it's probably not a great spot for the Giants D by any stretch, but that's at least intriguing with Harris only being 3,000.
Yeah, maybe some Will Tye instead of the receivers, but I don't know. Cool. Any last thoughts on receivers before we move to speaking of Will Tye tight ends?
What do you guys think Watkins' ownership will be coming off huge games, but in a tough on paper matchup? Too high?
I think it'll be really high because I think the general public doesn't know that. And I saw the stat. It's like on the outside, Cowboys only giving up 2 touchdowns on the outside, which is like all the routes that are like long outside. I can't remember how they clarified it, but it's basically saying this is what Watkins does. The Cowboys are the best at defending it. So we'll see. I don't know. What do you think his ownership's going to be?
Yeah, I think it's going to be too high. I also am not going to really be on Watkins because I think it's going to be too high. And also, let's not forget that they might run 8 plays in that game because the Cowboys just run the ball and drain the clock and stuff. They're really bad to face you don't want too many guys going against the Cowboys, not because they're great on defense, but and also they, except for one game against Green Bay, they also don't blitz. So that's the reason they're better on the outside. They just keep their safeties out there. They don't blitz too much. So, I'm not on Watkins this week.
Okay. Cool. All right.
Could have been on him last week maybe with Tyrod, but whatever.
All right, Tyrod's an okay guy to naked. Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's keep on moving. 2 more positions to talk about: tight ends and defense, obviously, to end it. So starting with tight ends, we'll obviously go to cash places. I think there's a couple obvious ones here, but I'll kick it to you, Pete, and let you start.
And Julius Thomas is probably the most obvious play for me going against the Saints. Mm-hmm. I just think that he's too cheap relative to what his expectation is going to be. And then at the expensive end, I mean, I love Jordan Reed and Rob Gronkowski. I think I like Jordan Reed probably a little bit more. And then, I don't hate Ben Watson, but he's kind of expensive. And, you have the Breeze situation. So those are the guys I'm kind of looking at so far. I could see an argument for either of the tight ends in the Kansas City game too. But that's kind of where I'm looking initially. And I think Delaney Walker on DraftKings with point per reception is another nice play as well.
Cool. So, Chris, what are your thoughts on cash for tight ends?
I'm actually finding myself now that the Beckham suspension is upheld, I would go with Will Tye in cash just because I don't like to pay up for tight end in cash games whenever I can just because it's pretty much the most volatile of the skill positions. So, Ty is a guy, I think he'll get enough targets to pay off that bottom barrel salary is $3,500. So that's a guy I would look at. And then Julius Thomas is the other guy I'm looking at on FanDuel, especially. Thomas, the guy where there's the pricing structures a little different. So those are really my 2 cash game guys.
Yeah, we're all on one guy who's JT, so that's probably a good sign that he's a good play in cash games. And then on DraftKings, because of how cheap the min price or cheaper tight ends are, there is a bigger deviation, which makes it harder, very difficult to play someone like Gronk in cash or Greg Olsen now. It's so difficult. There's just a huge cost where you can't pay up for a running back or a quarterback, which is a problem. So I think that Ertz at 3,100, who's now getting some targets there in a pretty good matchup and one that I think could turn into a shootout. I like that game a lot. I like Ertz where you just sort of roll the dice. He's not as safe as probably Thomas or some other guys, but for what you save, I do like him a lot.
Cool. So one guy that we haven't mentioned at all, but it's kind of a staple that we always have to mention, tight ends going against the Raiders. And we have Antonio Gates sitting right here at 5K, just a little under Julius Thomas. But, I agree that Julius Thomas is kind of the obvious guy, an elite matchup as well. But yeah, so, I guess maybe we can move on to tournament guys, and maybe Antonio Gates is a guy that we can talk about because he's just a little bit cheaper. But if guys are on Thomas, you could pivot to Antonio and get some ownership discount in a awesome matchup as well. So Pete, I'll start with you on tournament matchups.
Gates is interesting going against Oakland, who to start the season was just the worst in the tight end. We wanted to stream against them all the time. It's one of those things, though, where I really try to stay away from old guys at the end of the year, especially now that we don't have a narrative where they're not in their last game in San Diego. But definitely an intriguing play for me. I think Kelsey is a really nice tournament play. Saw a lot of targets to start last game, a lot of those short targets. Maybe they're trying to get him in space a little bit more, so I think that's nice. And then Zach Ertz is one of my favorite tournament plays. I really like his upside. I think he's a really talented player, and I would just like to see him get involved a little bit more. But I think given his talent, he's always a nice tournament play here against Washington.
Cool. Yeah, Chris, I'll bounce to you next.
Cool. One guy I'm looking at is Zach Miller. of the Bears. He's probably going to go way well owned. The Buccaneers are 31st in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Cutler's been looking for Miller in the red zone. He's coming off 2 games. He's got at least 5 catches in each. So that's a guy, I don't think people will be on him. He's pretty cost effective. And then, yeah, I think Greg Olsen is a tournament play because, like Bale said, he's just way too expensive to play in cash. But the Falcons have not been good against tight ends, and just because of how well Cam Newton is playing, I think you really you want to get exposure to his receivers. So Olsen will be a tournament play for me. I don't know if people will want to necessarily pay up for him. They might go with Jordan Reed instead, or just go with Gronk. So even though Olsen's kind of been producing lately, I don't think his ownership will be too crazy. So that's another guy I'm looking at. And then, yeah, I do like Zach Ertz. I like Will Tye in tournaments as well. And Watson in tournaments if Breeze is good to go, because I think his ownership might be low just because Thomas is sitting there a little cheaper.
Yeah, I do like the Greg Olsen call. He's kind of in that similar spot where Hopkins and Julio are on the wide receiver side, where he's just in a weird spot pricing-wise that people just aren't going to go. They're either going to say, okay, well, I would rather have Gronk for just $600 more, or else I'm fine with going down to Jordan Reed or, obviously way down to Thomas or whoever, or even Kelsey down in the low fours. So I do think Greg Olsen's going to be pretty low. So he's definitely interesting in tournaments to me. So Bales, I'll kick it to you. Barnage is your guy right
now. I think I'd rather have Kelsey, I think, in tournaments this week. I thought the analysis on Greg Olsen was really good. So he was one of my guys that I think most people will go to Gronk or go down to Jordan Reed, who's probably a better value, maybe. And then Ben Watson is probably slightly overpriced. But that game, again, you want to have exposure to that game in tournaments, I think. So if Breeze is in and you're willing to overpay just slightly for Ben Watson, I think that makes some sense in tournaments, especially at higher stakes where people are going to be a little bit more price sensitive and realize that he's overpriced. And it makes more sense to be contrarian as opposed to value based, where you might just play JT in a $9 or even the Millionaire Maker or something like that.
So, Bales, do you think – so I always have trouble, trying to guess ownership with these guys where, you have a really good matchup in a game that you want to target. So you want to get exposure to that team. But do you think people, potentially they're trying to get exposure to the New Orleans offense? Do you think that maybe Brandon Cooks being a popular wide receiver target, his price would potentially bump Watson down because people won't want to roster both of them?
Yeah, potentially, I guess. I think it just has more to do with Watson's price, but that's an interesting idea. I suppose if there's an obvious stack that the guys around him will be lower. I don't know what the numbers are on that. I know personally that I've been way more willing to stack offenses than I was in the past. I think we saw a guy win the Millionaire Maker with, I think, 5 guys on one team.
Including the defense, yeah.
Yeah, the Steelers. It was the Steelers.
Yeah, so there's more upside. Yeah, there's more upside in stacking offenses, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, whatever, than some people think. So I'm definitely more inclined to go with double stacks or occasionally a triple stack than I was in the past. So I'll probably, if I stack that offense, if Breeze is in, then I'll go both.
Why do you think that is? You think there's just such a floor if a game goes off, where it's it just minimizes your chances of not hitting on a guy?
Yeah, when a game – well, I think that the perception of playing in tournaments is you need all this upside and that players steal points from one another, and that if you play if you're playing teammates, they're sort of vulturing points, especially touchdowns from another, which is maybe true in some sense. But to win a big GPP, you need all these guys to go off anyway. It's very unlikely. If you stack a team, you do need them to score 40-plus points. You need them to really go off. But the chances of you winning with all these different players anyway is really low, right? Yeah. So I think it's just how we perceive upside probably.
And it comes down to salary too. It's like players could steal points from each other. Yes, not everyone can score a touchdown on the same drive, but if a team is scoring 40 points and there's 6 touchdowns to go around, you're going to have exposure to that team. It's not a, it's if the players are affordable, if Watson is 5,300 and Cooks is in the 60s, and if you can afford those guys like we saw with the Steelers and they all go off, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's a different story if, I remember I guess a better example is like last year, but when Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb were both super expensive. Okay, maybe it's a different story because that might cut it into the value you're getting out of that. There might be an upside in terms of just dollars per point, but especially when you have these moderately to lower priced players like Bales mentioned earlier with Cousins, Reed, and Jackson. It's like these guys are priced low enough that you're not really losing upside because they're still capable of returning the dollar per point value you need for tournaments. So
yeah, when you're talking about
probably when guys are underpriced and we think they're going to be overowned, a good way to be contrarian is to stack that entire offense if you think it has enough upside, because then you're still getting lots of salary cap flexibility elsewhere. You're being contrarian on chalk in a way because even though they're underpriced and they're going to be in a lot of lineups, there's probably not too many combinations that are similar to yours where you're going like, say, Roethlisberger, D'Angelo, Antonio, and Martavis in one lineup.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, that's a good point. Good discussion. So any last thoughts on tight end before we move on to defense? All right, cool. Let's keep on going and end here on defense. So we'll kick it to Pete. Favorite cash plays on the defensive side?
I'm probably going to pay up for defense this week. I'm liking Kansas City a ton versus Cleveland. I think they're probably my favorite option overall. Also have to like Seattle in this spot. I think those are the two defenses that we'll see a ton of people on. And then I think Denver is another really nice defense. Obviously, I'm a huge Bronco fan, a little bit biased there, but against McCarron, who hasn't had that much experience yet. I know I'm mildly impressed with him so far. Or not mildly, I'm pretty impressed with him so far, but Denver at home, I still think they have an elite defense, even though they got shredded by Pittsburgh in that second half. I think that those are the three kind of chalky defenses for me this week.
Cool. Yeah, Chris, I'll kick it to you now.
Yeah, Kansas City is my top defensive play. They have scored double-digit fantasy points in 7 of their last 8 games, and that is really amazing consistency for a defense. They're favored by about 12 and a half points, depending where you look. So that's my top play, and it's a situation where I wonder if, because the Seahawks actually have a slightly larger spread, what's been happening in the past few weeks is the Seahawks and Chiefs have kind of been neck and neck as kind of top defensive plays, and the Seahawks have been owned a whole lot more. So I wonder if that will be the case this week because the Chiefs did so much better than them last week. But I'd want to look at maybe some Thursday ownership percentages on FanDuel and kind of decide, which of those top defenses I want to have more exposure to, because I think I'd rather have the lower owned one in tournaments. And then in tournaments, defense is really tough position to predict. So a lot of times I just like to look at defenses who don't usually have large spreads because they'll usually be low owned anyway. And one of those defenses this week is the Lions. They're 9-point favorites, and I don't think many people will be on them against San Fran, but just because of that spread, their defense I would look at 2,800. And then the Titans are minimum priced at home against the Texans. They're going to be going against the backup quarterback, and that's a situation where, as I mentioned, it could just be one of those sloppy games. And in those kind of sloppy games, things could a bounce could go your way. You could get a kick return, you could get a fumble recovery return, interception, something like that. So minimum price defenses, I'll definitely consider the Titans, and I consider the Texans actually in that same game. They've been playing some good defense of late. They put up 11 fantasy points in their last matchup at Indianapolis, and I think this is a kind of a similar situation for them where they're going to go against Mettenberger, and he's liable to make some mistakes. They're a young quarterback, so those are one looking at in tournament. And the Steelers as well. The Steelers are another team with a double-digit spread, and so looking at them as well.
Yeah, that was the defense I was going to bring up, the Steelers in tournaments. It looks like I believe Schaub's going to be back, right? He's like a pick six machine. So I love playing against the quarterbacks like that who are they're aggressive in those situations when they need to throw low percentage passes. Like some guys would just hold on to the ball or check it down, like Alex Smith, let's say, even when they're down. Not a great quarterback to go against. But Schaub, he's just going to force it in there. So I like that. And I agree. I think both of you said Kansas City defense is the top defense. And I agree with that. Even at 4,200, I think that we've seen a larger deviation in pricing on DraftKings with defenses the past few weeks, but we also have more certainty in which defenses are actually best and which matchups are best, which offenses are the worst. So because of that certainty, it's just a matter of, okay, are these prices actually reflective of the certainty that we have in how good these teams are? And even at 4,200, I think that Kansas City is probably the top play.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a ton to add because I think you guys kind of nailed the cash game plays. I think they're pretty obvious this week, so I won't go too much on them. And I guess we'll move to tournaments. Chris and Bales already gave some tournament ideas, and Pete, I'll kick it to you. I guess one team that's interesting to me quickly is the Vikings potentially. Looks like Odell's going to be out, and he's just such a large part of that offense, whether he's catching passes or just attracting attention, and the defense just scheme against him. So I would assume that Minnesota has a little bit higher ceiling with Beckham out, obviously. So at 2,500, I think they could be a potentially lower owned play this week. So Pete, any favorite tournament?
I like Minnesota defense for the reasons you mentioned. My tournament plays are pretty similar to my cash game plays this week. I'm going to load up on those more expensive elite defenses. But I had to take another kind of, just shot on someone. I guess it could be like Arizona at home. Obviously, it's a really tough matchup against Green Bay. Rodgers has been looking better. The team's been playing better. And in addition to that, Honey Badger is out. But because of all those things, they might be lower owned, and they're a lot cheaper this week than normal. So maybe that's a flyer defense. But for me, most of my exposure in tournaments will be similar to cash games.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. So any last thoughts on defense before we kind of wrap it up?
An interesting defense that I think recency bias will have everyone off is Carolina, because they gave up 35 points to the Giants last week, but they actually gave up no points to the Falcons offense the week before, and that's who they're going. They put up 23 points, fantasy DraftKings points against the Falcons 2 weeks ago. So at really low ownership, when we have a recent sample that they can play really well. Matt Ryan's just been throwing a ton of picks, and I think they'll target Julio no matter what, and that actually gives the Panthers some upside for Josh Norman to maybe get an interception or two. So that's a defense that I think will go really under the radar. That's an interesting tournament play.
Like that.
Yeah, I like that. All right, sounds good. So before we finish up, I'll just kind of throw out a question. So it sounds like everyone's kind of on board with a wide receiver in flex. Are you guys at all okay with a tight end in flex because of some of the value?
I'm okay with that every week.
In cash, yeah, I'm sorry.
I probably wouldn't do that, most likely. In tournaments, I'm okay with.
Yeah, I don't – yeah.
I think there's enough receiver options where you're just probably going to play one of those guys.
Yeah, Pete, you've gone double tight end in cash, right?
Yeah, I don't mind it. I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Well, don't listen to us.
I think it's fine, and depending on the week, depending on the spot. I think this week it's marginal. I think the receivers are so good that I'll probably do that. And there's not most of the weeks where I play two tight ends is where like a Scott Chandler week where I like him a lot, and Jordan Reed's really cheap, and it's a way to fit in 4 really good receivers or something, or 3 really stud receivers. That's generally when I go for that type of strategy.
Sure.
This week doesn't set up as well for that, but I don't hate it. I probably won't go that way this week though.
Cool. Sounds good. That's all I got. Any last words?
Fun pod, boys, and hopefully someone takes home $1 million. That's a Fantasy Lab subscriber. Great time with you four. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Chris. It was really good. Good analysis.
Nah, thanks for having me, guys. Really glad to finally get to talk some football with you guys.
Yeah, thanks again, Chris.
Cool. All right. Well, guys, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching whatever you did, and good luck this week. Hopefully, one of you guys take down the mill. So we'll talk to you guys next week for final week of the season, week 17. Merry Christmas to you guys. I enjoy spending time with family and watching some football.